Attempting to understand poverty is a bad idea in and of itself. Claiming to understand or to have understood poverty is absolute madness. If someone tells you that he understands poverty as a phenomenon, then that someone is either lying or is a fool. Now, mind you, I'm talking here about understanding poverty as a phenomenon and not about understanding how poverty feels like. That is a separate issue. Trying to understand poverty is misguided and mistaken for two reasons. First of all, because it's asking the wrong question. Poverty is the natural state of man. The question is, how did some people, both individually and as groups, have gotten rich and how come others did not? The answers may seem obvious, but they really aren't. The second reason is given by the fact that most data available for such a research project is inherently corrupted. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. Now, I've been wanting to make this video for about 2 months now, and I kept on postponing it because I'm constantly on the road. I mean, it's been almost a month since I've seen the inside of my actual home. Plus, I've also been ill, which furthered the problems with videos this month. Anyway, enough waiting, so let's dive into the topic. So, I said in the intro that there are two reasons for which it is mistaken to attempt to understand poverty. One, that it means asking the wrong set of questions, and two, that all of the data is corrupted. Both of these reasons are pretty straightforward, but academicians and what Nassim Taleb calls the intellectuals yet idiots have needlessly complicated the conversation. Basically, asking why are some people poor, or more specifically asking why this or that particular group is poor, implies the premise that wealthiness, or the state of being non-poor, is somehow normal or to be expected. But nothing could be further from the truth. In a way, it is true that all men are created equal, in the sense that all men are created equally poor, at least in terms of material wealth. I mean, when you're born, you have nothing. You don't have a house, you don't have knowledge about almost anything, heck, you don't even have a pillow. But notice I say almost anything, and insist upon the caveat of at least in terms of material wealth. And because I say this because there are at least two factors that are predetermined by accident and that can rarely be compensated for, or at the very least could have rarely been compensated for until very recently. One of these aspects is, of course, genetic legacy. Now, while it is not true that geniuses are born, it is, however, true that intellect is, at least in part, genetically heritable. Same is true for other abilities, such as the ability to run fast, or faster than your peers, or the ability to see or not to see certain things. And yes, the differences vary quite a lot depending on some other immutable characteristics, such as sex, race, the age of the mother, the age of the father, and geography. Although geography is not a completely immutable characteristic, it is nonetheless an aspect upon which the individual doesn't really have a choice, in the sense that you and I didn't have a choice in being born in the town we were born in, and most likely didn't have a choice in the town we grew up in, at least until reaching the age of reason. Now, speaking about the age of reason, that's also another aspect that's partly determined by genetics. I mean, I, for instance, started working for shekels at the age of 12 and founded my first business at the age of 17 without external help. Now, that wasn't an accident. Both of my parents have also developed earlier than the norm. Anyway, I'm straying from the topic here. So, now that we established that poverty is the natural state of man, let's dwell a bit more on the correct question, namely, why do certain people, both individually and as groups, get rich and others don't, or do get rich at a much slower pace? Well, there are two big reasons, in addition to a plethora of other smaller reasons. These two are as follows: information and geography, in this order. The easiest way to explain this is through examples. So, example 1, Australian Aboriginals. Actually, this example encompasses both the information and the geography aspects. But because Australian Aboriginals were largely isolated from the rest of the world well into the late 19th century, they developed quite distinctly from the rest of the human race, well, at least if you can call that development. The shiny example is the piece of information that iron is useful. This piece of information did not reach Australia at all until 1788. Now, nowadays, Australia is one of the biggest world suppliers of iron. There are very few places in the world where there is more iron than it is in Australia. Yet Aboriginals remained poor until 1788 relative to Europe or to Southeast Asia, in spite of the fact that nobody oppressed them until that point. Now, what I'm trying to show with this example is that rising from poverty is intimately dependent on information. Now, even though nobody oppressed the Australian Aboriginals from times immemorial until 1788, even though they were standing on the highest amount of known basic resources in the world for most of this period, and even though they had the enormous advantage of not being under immediate threat of war, unlike Europeans, and despite of all these, their civilization did not develop nowhere near to how the European civilization did, even though they seemingly had all the ingredients. They only lacked, however, one ingredient: information. They did not discover that iron is useful. And without that information, there is and there was no trade, even though they had access to the large oceans of the world, which is another inherent and immutable advantage that comes by chance. Alright, let's bring in example number 2. Far Western Europe versus Far Eastern Europe. Now, by Far Western Europe, I mean places like Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, the Viking Empire, and the former kingdom of the Danish law, now known as England. By Far Eastern Europe, I mean the west and the southwest of modern-day Russia and the far east of modern-day Ukraine. These areas are even today distinctly poorer than other areas that are politically and racially similar, even areas that are closer geographically to them. For instance, Armenia versus the Luhansk region in Ukraine. Now, both have been through invasions, both have been victims of genocide, namely Holodomor versus the Ottoman perpetrated Armenian genocide. Both have been raped in all imaginable ways by Stalin, and both had to deal with territorial and political instability in the last 2 decades. Yet Armenia is distinctly richer and has always been richer historically. Heck, the city of Yerevan is older than Rome itself and one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. The difference? Geography. Armenia almost always had access to seaports and thus access to trade, and trade is the clearest path to enrichment in spite of what others may tell you. Also, besides access to ports, Armenia was also close to a great civilization, the Persian Empire. Now, being next door to Persia was highly useful for Armenia way into the 20th century, more precisely until 1979, when suddenly the place went full Allahu Akbar and has since been a continuous source of trouble for Armenia. But anyway, that's a story for another day. Now, with this comparison in mind, expand your mind to the broader comparison: Far Eastern Europe versus Far Western Europe. The far west of Europe had access to the Atlantic and the Mediterranean Sea. Basically, once navigation technology became good enough, which happened around the 9th century and then slowly even better than that towards the 14th and 15th century, the peoples living in that area suddenly had an enormous opportunity that did not exist and could not exist for many hundreds of years to follow in the far east of Europe. And the peoples living in the far west of the continent took full advantage of the opportunity presented to them. And good for them. because doing so enriched them and the rest of the world enormously. But it was this combination of information and geography that made the whole process possible to begin with. Now, mind you, information and geography are the fundamental or the primary reasons, but they are not enough, or as we say in mathematics, they are a necessary but not a sufficient condition for enrichment. After all, the exact same geographical conditions were met in West Africa, particularly Northwest, and while the Vikings were roaming through the modern-day Canada, West Africans still hadn't learned that there is more than one continent. But Europeans would not have pulled this off, no matter how great their culture would have been, without these two fundamentals, information and geography, and particularly geography. The reverse is also true. You can have the most impeccable information and ideal geographical conditions, and yet you still can't pull much off without appropriate and or adapted culture, or should I say, a culture geared towards progress. Anyway, to read more about this, I recommend you read Dr. Thomas Sowell's latest book, Wealth, Poverty and Politics, An International Perspective. That's where I actually picked up the example with the Far East versus the Far West. Alright. Now let's get to the second reason why pursuing the endeavor of understanding poverty is, at the very least, mistaken. The corrupted data. This one's really simple. Basically, poverty means whatever a bureaucrat in Berlin, Bucharest, Brussels, Budapest, Washington, Beijing, or Tokyo wants it to mean. And to make things worse, the bureaucrats don't even agree with each other. And on top of that, their definition doesn't even apply consistently within the same country and sometimes within the same region. For example, let's take the poverty line in Germany. What constitutes poor in Bavaria, a Bundesland that consistently votes as right-wing as possible in every election, is actually middle class in Bremen Bundesland, a place that continuously votes as far left as possible in every election. The most disconnected from the real world must be, however, the American statisticians. The poorest 2% of Americans have more wealth, more food, more comfort, and more living space than upper middle class Swedes or Frenchmen. By world average, there is no such thing as poor people in the United States. And again, this is measured in actual wealth rather than dollars. Because if we are to measure in dollars, the gap between the poorest Americans and the rest of the world is even wider, but measuring in dollars is, however, useless since the monetary policy on the dollar has gotten increasingly socialistic and highly unstable, so comparing the data would be meaningless and even downright dishonest. In other words, the data is corrupted, and intentionally so. In the United States, the poverty level for a 3-person household or family is an income of $20,160 per year. Any one household earning less than that is officially poor. Now, in addition to the fact that this doesn't take into account the benefits, either provided by private parties or by the state, nor does it include tax deductions, discounts, and other similar things, this number is also useless since no perspective is being applied. Now, this means two things. First, it means that people de facto earning more still end up being categorized as poor. And second, it means that this particular number is geographically and culturally dependent. So, for instance, $20,160 means absolute poverty in, let's say, New York, but does it mean absolute poverty in Mississippi? The GDP per capita in Mississippi is just mildly above the federal poverty level, so either Mississippi is extremely poor Congo style or the reference frame is wrong. Now, I dare to argue that it is the latter rather than the former. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that in addition to poverty being rather relative, the further meddling by bureaucrats have made the topic almost impossible to objectively analyze. As far as I'm concerned, when I hear poverty, I am thinking of the common man's understanding of poverty, which is closer to the 1950s understanding, namely lack of shelter or irregular access to proper sheltering, lack of access to clean water, minuscule or no access to food, lack of access to heating sources in the case of area where extreme cold happens regularly, and minuscule or no access to clothing. Now that is poverty. And that is what most people on this planet think when they hear the term poverty, because that's what poverty is. Not being able to get dressed, not having a place to sleep, not being able to eat, not being able to bath and drink safe water, and not being able to warm yourself during winter time. Yet in recent years, thanks to the enormous wealth created through free markets, many people in the world can afford the luxury of thinking that they are being poor because they don't have regular access to fast internet, or because they can't afford a newer car and have to rely on a 1970s or 1980s era vehicle. Heck, the poorest people in Europe and North America today live better than King George I, or King William IV, for that matter. Now, mind you, this is not to say that one should not be concerned with the conditions of those on very low incomes. That's far from what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that one should use a proper reference frame and ask the proper questions. Labeling otherwise rich people as poor only serves to increase the likelihood of most people to vote for even more governmental dependency, because that's how human emotions work. But as recent history has shown us conclusively, time and time again, increased governmental dependency does not alleviate poverty. If anything, it makes things relatively worse. So, to sum up, first, in order to study economic development in a comprehensive manner, one has to ask, why is this group or this area, this person, whatever, why is this group rich in comparison to this group or area or person? 2. One has to always ask the question, compared to what? One should ask this before venturing into making prescriptive statements. Now, by prescriptive statement, I mean one that starts with, this should happen, or this policy should be supported. You get the point. 3. One has to be open to all evidence before claiming to have understood anything. In other words, for our topic at hand, it is not always the first answer that is the correct one. I suppose this advice is for the leftist-minded who tend to assume that someone was being oppressed by someone else or someone was stolen from by someone else as an explanation for poverty. This is almost always wrong, especially when it comes to absolute poverty in present days. Now sure, sometimes it is true that a bunch of privileged warmongers rape the poor and strip them of their means of enrichment, but historically speaking, that's usually the exception rather than the norm, even though you won't hear that in a common history academia course. And last but not least, number 4, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. Aiming at making everyone equally rich is unreasonable and impossible. Making everyone equally poor, however, it is possible. It's called socialism. The only thing realistically possible is slow, gradual trade-offs thought of with careful consideration at what is being lost for every gain. As Dr. Thomas Sowell, from whom I also took the motto, so as he always says, you can make some things better by making others a little worse, but oftentimes making some things slightly better immediately means making others a lot worse. Hence, prudence and, dare I say, conservative approaches are always preferable. And with that being said, thank you for watching and thank you for your continuous support. I guess I'll see you soon on Freedom Alternative.